How you doing, Artem?
Hey, hello, I'm doing great. What about you?
I am awesome. Thank you for being the first guest for TKYT in 2024. Your session has been a long time in the works. I have been wanting to learn this, and I'm so excited that you have the time today to come, hang out with me for an hour. Let's geek out on API mocking, MSW, and remix, right?
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here finally, so I hope folks appreciate what we're gonna showcase today.
Yeah, definitely. So before, let's just start on the note of you introducing yourself. So tell us who Artem is, what you've been doing, and especially, very importantly, a fun fact about you.
Sure. So, my name is Artem. I'm a software engineer. I'm based in Czech Republic right now. I have been fascinated by engineering since I was a kid, and eventually it led me to landing my first full-time job. I never studied engineering, but it kind of find myself by itself, if that makes sense. Here,
Yeah,
can you hear me?
that's
Because I think
that's
something
interesting.
froze.
Yeah, but I think we're good. So it's gonna be saved on both sides. That's why I like the platform. So you all watching TKYT, you could see that we are trying something new. We're using Riverside. So hopefully it comes out really well. I've heard good things and I really like the potential of the platform. But yeah, thank you, Artem, for introducing yourself. You say you're originally from Czech Republic, right?
No, I'm actually from Ukraine, but I moved
Oh,
to Czech
Ukraine.
Republic
Okay.
7 years ago.
Oh wow, yeah, that's interesting. So, like, tell me a little bit, like, you didn't tell me the fun fact about you. So let's start from there. The fun fact, one fun fact that is non-tech something. Yeah, you have to if you have to think about it, you need to be having fun outside code, right? So yeah, so let's
Yeah,
hear what
I
fun fact.
think I don't know what would be considered a fun fact. Well, I'm a medical doctor by
Oh,
education. I guess that
that's
can
a
be
fun
fun to
fact.
someone.
Yeah.
And also, I think the very first piece of code I ever wrote
Mm-hmm.
was a table in HTML.
Wow. Like the oh. Why? I wouldn't say that was my first piece of code. My piece of code was basic and bash script, but table in HTML. Why? Why tables? What? Like was it like something you wanted to get on, or that was your first introduction to like web development?
Yeah, I was fascinated by magazine designs and layouts, and then I got
Oh,
into visual design
yeah.
as well, like when I was like 10 years old, I don't know. And
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to bring them to life. So I
Okay.
started searching for the means to do that. And I stumbled upon this thing called HTML. I found some really nice learning resources. And I remember I opened some random chapter and they were teaching about a table tag. And like
Yeah.
keep in mind, this was back in the day when people still use this marquee running line
Yep.
in
I
HTML. So it
remember.
was a very old age of HTML, and I was hacking the
Oh,
tables and like experimenting. It was really fun.
yeah. Probably HTML 3 or 4. I think it should be 3 if you're like 10 years ago, like you. Yeah, I can remember back in the days where we lay out stuff with tables. Oh, how far
Yeah,
we've come with grid and flexbox, the enjoyment we're having, right? Back in the days with CSS, like image stripes for icons, it was just crazy. But yeah,
yeah,
it was the good old days. I don't know. Yeah. So I think speaking about technologies, right? I think at the core of what we're going to discuss about today are APIs, right? And
yeah.
more specifically API mocking.
Mhm.
And I want you to like give us like to someone who hasn't heard about APIs and API mocking, how would you introduce it to them? Like if I say like Artem, hey, what are you working on? Hey, I'm working on APIs and API mocking. What is that?
Yeah, so let's try to come up with some introduction. So, well, APIs, just to start, is the way for computers to talk.
Mm-hmm.
So, when your web page asks something from a server, well, they use an API. This is their programmatic interface to exchange information, requests. It can be literally anything. Probably one of the easiest examples of API is imagine you have an electric stove in your kitchen. So these buttons of the stove is your API to communicate with it.
Oh,
And perhaps even for the stove to communicate back to you. I don't know, with
Yeah.
some display or some information. So that's it. And one of the types of APIs is network requests. So as I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, since we're talking about web, well, when clients and servers speak, they have this protocols like HTTP, and they exchange data. And when you develop your app and when you test your app, sometimes you may not have the server, but you
Mm-hmm.
still want to be able to develop this communication, to
Yeah.
kind of pretend that it's there. So
Mm-hmm.
once it's there, it just works. Or sometimes you want to test your component or your app, and you shouldn't really be making those real network requests because they can do a bunch of side effects. They can charge your card. They can ruin. They can fail your test for not for basically for the wrong reason.
Yeah.
And this is when you reach out to API mocking as one of the solutions. And in itself, API mocking is just a technique to establish a testing boundary. It's
Mm.
like your whole app is a huge slice of bread, and API
Oh.
mocking is your knife. So you use that knife to tell the test where your app ends. For example, you make a request to fetch the user. So you
Mm-hmm.
introduce API mocking to tell the test, okay, I make the request, but
Yeah.
all that comes after is not my concern anymore. So I mock that part. There
Mm.
are various ways to mocking and stubbing and testing, but today we will focus on API mocking in particular, which means
Mm-hmm.
intercepting network requests and mocking their responses.
Yeah. That's so at the core of API mocking, it's mostly for isolating your application for testing. So you sort of like make it a little bit like a black box, right? Where you don't really care
Kind of.
how the third party API or the production API is implemented, but you just know like these are the results I'm gonna get from it if I actually call it in production. So I'm just gonna mock that. So I have this like a black box. So it's like a black box kind of test. Does that
Yeah.
work in your worldview?
Yeah, with API mocking, you basically make network communication as a given, so you can
Okay.
control. You can
Mm,
model happy paths, you can model errors, network errors, server errors, and you basically become in charge of this external factor of the server,
uh,
of the network connection. And because you are in charge, you can model different scenarios, and you can
mhm.
prepare your app to those scenarios.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. And it's I really like that you spoke about happy path because most times when I see people implement tests or even just like manually testing your code, you only test like if the table has records. You don't really test
Uh-huh.
what happens. How does the table show if there are no records on it, or
Yeah,
how do you handle that? So I really like the emphasis on not just testing the happy path because of course you don't have most times your application is going to be in the best state, like the state without data. How do you really handle that? So I really like that you're also focusing on not just like, okay, give me users. What happened when there are no users? How do we handle that?
yeah.
Yeah, that's fun. Yeah, so I think where we could go with this, because back in 2020 or 2019, I wrote a series of articles for Smashing Magazine on something similar to what you've built called Mirage. I don't know if
Mhm.
you know it. I think it came from the
Nice.
Ember world, and that was my first intro to mocking APIs, and it was really fun. I kind of like it, but
Mhm.
I don't use it anymore. But so that tells me that even before the library you built, which we're going to speak about now, there have been other attempts, or in other words, not to JavaScript, of mocking APIs, right? But
Yeah,
yours, you're sort of mocking API because your service or your package is MSW, which is mock service worker, right?
yeah.
What makes your approach? Because I think yours is kind of interesting to a lot of people, like Considers and a lot of other people that are using it. Why is your approach all that enticing? And why did you build mock service worker? Because of course you might have gotten pains from other solutions you've used in the past. So why did you build mock service workers, and why do you base your API mocking tool on service worker?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, there has been quite a number of solutions in JavaScript,
Yeah.
like Mirage and Knock and Pretender and PolyJS. There's a lot of really good solutions, and they've been working for developers for years.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, why I decided to build MSW? Well, the history behind it is that I just wasn't happy with what our team was using back in the day. And I decided to come up with an over weekend prototype of how I imagined the perfect API mocking to work. So this included that we don't stub any request clients. You don't change or mutate your window.fetch, XML HTTP request, and so forth. This included kind of transparent interception. I want to see those requests actually happening on the page, because what happens with conventional API mocking tools, it's exactly what you described. It's a black box. Your window.fetch call becomes a black box. It no longer calls the underlying browser or node APIs. No request validation is happening. No connections are established. That is gone. The problem was that in most of the solutions, when you mock APIs, you pretend that the request was made. And that's a really important distinction.
Okay.
And what I try to achieve with MSW is that you make the request for real, but you only pretend that the server responded with particular data. So you kind of push this boundary further. And in itself, the main principle, the main difference of MSW is that it encourages you to think about API mocking as a standalone thing, as a standalone layer. This means that
Okay.
you don't go through like particular tools you have. Like you may have something in testing, you may have something during development. Then there are different levels of testing, end-to-end and integration. And there's a bunch of frameworks you may be using, and they ship with their own API mocking capabilities. So you have to configure them separately. They don't really talk to each other because they can't. They live in different environments. They have slightly different purpose and completely different APIs. There is very little you can reuse, and you feel like you repeat yourself over and over, but you really just want to do one thing. I want to control the network. It doesn't really matter where. And this is precisely what MSW does. It pushes this API mocking layer up, and then you integrate your network description into any environment and any tool you want. So in this
Okay.
light, MSW promotes the environment-based interception as opposed to like request client-based interception.
Nice. Wow. So environment-based interception rather than request-based interception. That's really interesting. So one thing, from what you've described, I think the DX is really flawless. I haven't had time to play with it. That's why I have this sort of session. So like I get to play with it from the eyes of the
Yeah.
maker. So one thing I've always hated is when the mocking and the testing sort of gets in the way, or I have to do some checks in order to be in prod versus being test land. So how do I easily switch to like get the actual API call than rather to be mocked by mock service worker? So how does that play out? Like I think you can't describe it to me physically or with words. So I think at this junction you've really spoken a lot about it, but it's time for us to show MSW, and I feel like that way we're going to like understand it some more, and it's really really going to be very very much easy like to pass the message across. So you did say that so today we're doing full stack applications like mocking the API, the APIs on like Remix, right?
Yeah.
So Remix of course has been having a lot of buzz too, and I guess it's your own tool of choice. So yeah, so are you ready to like like let's just see how we do that in MSW? I'm very interested because I want to like mock APIs also in my own stack as well.
Mm-hmm.
So can we?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Let's see MSW in practice, basically.
yeah, for sure.
I will share my screen. Okay. So good. So here we have a Remix project. But the first thing to notice straight away is that MSW is not bound to any particular framework. This includes testing frameworks or like application frameworks like Remix. And because MSW is environment-based, you can use it anywhere JavaScript can run and with anything that runs your JavaScript. So I'm going to showcase Remix example today. We have a bunch of other examples on GitHub with frameworks like VTest, Vue, Svelte, Angular, basically, and we're trying to add more and more. So if folks are working with some frameworks that are not featured, I really encourage you to submit a PR and have this example for everybody.
Yeah.
But that's the first thing. Let's take a look how it works. No matter where you use MSW, you start your experience with describing the network. So you
Okay.
create a file that can be something like handlers.ts. And the purpose of this file is to describe the contract. How do you want the network to behave? In this case, I have, for example, a request handler, which is a function that controls the network, that intercepts the HTTP GET request to a particular third-party API. and then it accepts the callback function or a resolver function, how it's called in MSW, that decides how to handle this request. There are multiple ways you can handle a request. So one of the most used ways is just to respond with the mock data. So in this case, we are responding with a JSON response that has particular user object, and it sends it to whoever is requesting this. You can also
Nice.
just observe the request. You can perform it as is and then kind of patch the original data with the mock data. There's a bunch of stuff you can do, and I encourage you to explore the docs if you want to learn more. And we also support GraphQL out of the box. So here we have a GraphQL query that is called list movies, and in the same fashion, we are handling it by responding with particular list of movies using the GraphQL response structure. So it has the data root level key. And you write a bunch of these handlers. You can split them by your domain or maybe by services. You can split them by heavy paths and errors, and you describe how the network should behave. But on its own, this array, these handlers, they won't really do anything. It's just functions. So what you need to do then is to integrate MSW into the environment you want. You do that by defining this integration points. For example, you can have one for browser and one for node, and you can see how kind of tiny and similar they are. The whole purpose of this integration points is to call the right API. So as you may know from the name, MSW, mock service worker, uses the service worker standard API in the browser to intercept requests on the network level. So this is why you use the setup worker function for the browser integration. And then in Node.js, there are no service workers. So we are doing Node native module augmentation to achieve the same thing. So for you as a developer, you just call the setup server function and provide it with the network description you have.
Cool.
And basically, you get this server and worker objects, and you use them to enable API mocking. So let's take a look how this works. So for example, in Remix provides us with specific entry points to your client and server builds. So in the entry.client, we can import our worker our browser integration, and we can start the service worker, which will enable the API mocking conditionally, because we don't want to ship mocks to production. And then we wrap it all in a nice prepare app function, or whatever you want to call it, and we defer the rendering of our application until the worker is ready. Now, why do we do this? The thing is, service workers register asynchronously. Because when you register a worker, it goes through a number of phases. First, the browser checks if there's already a worker running, then it compares their versions, it decides which one should be the latest, it queues the latest one to be replacing the old one, then it finally replaces it, and so forth. This can take a little time. It's asynchronous. And we don't want to introduce any race conditions between this worker registration and our application making requests on initial render. To eliminate this, we're just deferring the rendering here after the app is prepared, after the MSW is running.
Nice.
So this is the browser side integration. For Node.js, we have similar module from Remix, which is called entry.server, and we import the server object. And it's much simpler here because there's no workers in Node, and API mocking is applied synchronously, instantaneously. Okay. So once you call server.listen, everything past that point will be visible to MSW, and it will be able to handle it. So as well, we do this conditional check to only run mocks in development, and we start the server. And this is the bare-bone integration into your app. Now, how it looks on runtime, here's this app open, and what it does, it has a single route, the single index route, that fetches some information on the server using the loader function in Remix, and it sends the data to the client to render. So here we're fetching the user, we read it response as JSON, and we send it back to the client. And in the client, we will render hello first name. And you can see on the page that it returns us the John first name, because this is precisely what we have in our handlers, in this handler that is triggered on the server. You can already notice that these handlers, they don't mention any environments. They don't mention any request clients. because it doesn't really matter for MSW how or where you make this request call. It really
Yeah.
doesn't, because it sits on the environment level. The rest of your app sits above it. So it can afford not to care about that implementation details. And then we have a client-side request, and please don't torch me for just putting fetch in my render function. We have a fetch request to some local endpoint, some local route. And this
Yeah.
is a GraphQL request. You can spot this by the shape of the
Mm-hmm.
payload. And we will list the movies from some GraphQL endpoint on runtime when we click this particular button. So if we do
Mm-hmm.
this, we will see a list of movies.
Mm.
Just a second.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, yeah, sorry about that. So, quick question: both the browser and the node setup is needed for MSW to work, right? Like they go hand in hand.
That's not true. You decide that.
Okay.
Maybe you
Oh,
have just a Node.js server and you want to mock third-party APIs. You can just go and have only Node integration. Maybe you're building a completely client-side app. Then you don't need any of that, and you can just use the browser integration. So you kind of mix and match.
oh yeah.
And
So actually, that makes sense. So if I'm a backend person that wants to quickly mock responses, I'll use
yeah,
the node implementation. If I'm a
exactly.
front end person in my like our separate teams and I just want to like get what the backend is sending, I'll use the service worker implementation.
Yeah,
Makes sense. I like it.
yeah. And if we can take a look at the network and runtime, what actually happens. So let me refresh the page. When we do this runtime request to GraphQL endpoint, we can actually
Mhm.
see it happening because it does. Everything is
Mm.
like all the browser request logic is called, and you can see in the response
Yeah.
here, we're getting the structure of the mocks that we are
Mhm.
defining in our handlers.
Cool.
So this is one of the points I mentioned earlier, how it was crucial to me to have this observability and actually run all the request logic in the browser. It may not
Mhm.
seem like a big deal, but the closer you bring your app to how it runs in production,
Yeah.
the better development you get, the better
Mhm.
testing you get. So this is kind of the implied goal behind any testing tool you may be using. And I'm really happy that
Mm.
MSW allows you to push this boundary a little further and to have more logic run.
Mm. Yeah. I think I like it too. And it's sort of like like the classic example I've seen of this is where like for example during development the front end person just put like some John Doe in like the user profile, right? Like it
Yeah,
wasn't of course it didn't account to different length in names. So I've literally seen a production app that breaks because I have a very long name plus my middle name.
yeah.
So as soon as I input that, there was just like an overflow. I'm like, yep, this wasn't tested with actual close enough to production data to actually catch that in real time. So I actually get the point. So, but one thing that quickly comes to mind with this
Huh?
is how for like we know the client side purists or enthusiasts that don't really want to concern themselves with like how the backend is implemented.
Mhm.
I kind of wonder how close to production they can get because you can literally just go put some John Doe in there as well when you mock it, right? So
Yeah.
MSW sort of like feel like it's definitely placed to the favor to of the full stack developer
Mhm.
than the front end person. Do you think like that too?
I think you can use it
Mhm.
really in either situation.
Yeah.
So you can use it as a front end engineer when you, for example, when I was working on some e-commerce websites in the past, what
Yeah.
we often had is a huge time uh, kind of discrepancy between the front end and back end teams. So
Yes.
what ended up happening is I would build a front end feature and then it would sit in a pull request for 2 weeks until the backend would roll out the APIs and I can even try that feature. This was a
Mm,
huge stopper. It made us slow and really nobody was happy about it. So tools like MSW allow you to pretend the backend is sending you particular responses and you can even discuss those responses with your team
mm,
because you can come up to your backend engineer and say, hey, what will be the JSON you send? And they can just send you this example over Slack in a minute, but it will still take them 2 weeks to finish their work. But
of
you're not
course.
blocked by that anymore. You know the shape and you can kind of play around with your front end code. You can see how it handles these properties, how it handles errors. And this way you can really develop faster. As
Mm,
well as in the full stack applications, when you can control the server, But sometimes you want to focus on one thing. And I think I really speak from experience here when I'm trying to build something that is larger than a to-do list. I
Of
often
course.
find myself a little spread thin. Like I need to implement the backend, I need to implement the front end, but they kind of work together. Sometimes it's hard to isolate yourself, like focus yourself on one thing. But with MSW, I can just describe, for example, a GraphQL response. And this is all it takes for me to develop an app that actually uses a GraphQL client and does this query. I don't have to
Mm-hmm.
care about servers, about resolvers, about schemas just yet. And if I want to care about those things, I can have schema-based interception for GraphQL as well, just as easily.
Mm-hmm.
And only when I'm ready, I just remove this API mocking integration completely from my app, and it just works.
Mm. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense the because at the end of the day, the front-end person would mostly, or your UI mostly care about the state being sent from the server. Like, of course, the business logic is gonna like take some time to implement and
Yes, of
get
course.
right, but you just care about, okay, this is the output and I want to do stuff with it. So that definitely makes sense in terms of making teams move really quickly. Because like you said, you could just ask the backend folks, like, what are you sending? Just give me like like a JSON shape. Then you just
Yeah.
replicate that in MSW, then you go about your business. I like it.
And you can add business logic to these request handlers as well. In fact, when testing,
Oh.
I would encourage that. Like you can do things like checking for the particular input. I'm not sure. Let's try doing something like if
Mm.
request headers, for example, don't have a cookie, we can throw just a second like this.
Okay.
We can just return an error response. I don't know, like not authorized. So you can add
Mm.
this quick
Yeah.
business layer, and you can also add it on a test basis, not necessarily stuffing everything in one handler. This is actually discouraged. What I really like to recommend is describe the happy paths, and then whenever you need to deviate from those, just use overrides. We have a concept of network overrides, and the
Mm-hmm.
way it works, I can quickly show you, for example, in the server. When you access this worker or server object, you can use a use function. And then inside this function, you can describe the same handler, but you can handle this particular response differently. So for example, I'm in a test and I want to always respond with an error. So I
No.
would just write that, I don't know, like 500.
Mm.
And this way, your test always gets this behavior, no matter what your other handlers say. And you can like fall through the handlers, you can leverage this order of execution, and you can model really any network you want. In fact, if you want, I have an end-to-end test using Playwright right here, and I can show you how it's working.
You just read my mind. Let's do it.
Yeah, so basically, in this example, we have an end-to-end test that uses Playwright, and this test, it looks like this. What it does, it focuses on two things. It checks whether we are sending the right information from the server in our loader function. This is the hello John string right now. And then it checks the GraphQL query that we perform client side, that this data is actually rendered on the page. So these are these two things which we saw in the browser. We're just transferring it into test.
Yeah.
And if we run this test, let's go here. If we run this test, Playwright will run our application and it's going to check for the scenarios. So in this case, both of them are passing. Now, you may have noticed that there's nothing here about mocking about MSW. Well,
Yes,
this is
there's not.
because MSW is already integrated into our app. So we don't need to repeat this in the test. We can just run the app and rely on the network in the app to test it here too. But you can also expose the worker object globally in your app and then access it in Playwright to do those overrides that I mentioned. You can use worker.use, and for a particular test, you can completely change the behavior of the network. So this is how it works in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I really like the fact that the test is agnostic to the fact that you're using MSW.
Exactly.
It's really, really beautiful.
This test can allow to be agnostic because it's an end-to-end test. Now, you can also use MSW in integration tests. This example doesn't feature it. Maybe it's something I should add, but I can show you integration test using Vue in just a moment.
Yes, please.
So here's our like whole example with Vue, and Vue comes with a few integration tests like here. And what we do here is just mounting our app, and we are like expecting a particular greeting to be printed. So you see it's similar, hello, John. And in the same fashion, Vue is using vtest here. So we are rendering the greeting and we're rendering the list of movies, which is a GraphQL request as well. I'm trying to keep the same kind of requests and that replicate them in different frameworks. And I learned a lot about each framework just by doing the same thing in each. And if I recall correctly, so how this works, we have the same network description here. This is what you just saw in Remix. We have absolutely the same integrations for browser and server. And to make it work in tests, let me check my vtest config. Yeah, this is all okay. We have a setup file. And in the setup file, what we're doing, we are referencing the server object from our node integration, and we just call server.listen before all the tests run. So this is the bit we need to add to vtest. So before it runs your Vue app in integration environment, so basically Node.js, we enabling this server object to intercept requests and route them through your request handlers. And this is the same setup that you would have in Jest as well, though the intention is really the same. You would use these APIs, you then close the server after the tests are done. And a fun fact that some people still miss, there are no service workers in Node.js, as you know that, but there are no servers for MSW either. We just chose this name for convenience because people would think about MSW as a server. Because when you write request handlers, you kind of write them from the server's perspective. But in actuality, no servers are being spawned, and this is why server.listen is synchronous.
That's interesting. So there are no actual servers. You're not listening on any port. You're
No, of
just
course not.
you're just using your implementation to like send back the JSON when needed. That's interesting. I think that's really really fun. And like you said, it's what makes it to be synchronous, because if you're actually starting up an actual server, you got to wait for the server to like boot up, give it a port, blah blah blah. But none of this. Yeah, nice.
This is where people get the most value out of MSW, when they integrate it into different tools in different environments. Like you can use the same handlers for your integration tests. You can use them for your end-to-end tests with Playwright, like I showed you. You can use them while developing. We just saw the app running, and I can work on features, I can fix bugs, reproduce network scenarios, and all of that kind of comes down to a single API mocking layer. That's precisely what MSW is there for.
So this is amazing. I think you've really shown, first of all, I love the fact that your end-to-end tests are MSW agnostic. I don't even see MSW in there, except you want to override stuff with server.use or worker.use. But at the end of the day, you test as if you are actually making the actual network call.
Exactly.
Brilliant. I love it. And so in the wild, because you did mention that you made MSW because you see how it was painful to test in your work environment. Like I know Kent Seedorf is definitely in love with it in the Epic stack. Like in the wild, what do you see users of MSW do that really blow your mind? That well, I didn't know you could do it like this. Right?
I think one of the things I really liked when I saw it, one of the devs from our community shared this example. What they did, I can actually show you in the docs. I was so impressed. I put it straight into the docs because I think a lot of people can benefit from this.
Okay.
Let me see this. I think this was this one. Yeah. So what one of the teams were doing, so they were developing their app heavily in the browser, and they relied on MSW to basically control the network. But they quickly noticed that sometimes they want to go through the whole application in a particular network state. So you want to reproduce the whole, like, I don't know, like cart checkout flow in a particular state. If you are a guest, if you are like having 3 items in a cart, or if you get errors from the server, what they ended up doing, they created different scenarios. like a success scenario, an error scenario. And these scenarios, they handle the network differently. But how do you switch between those on runtime? Well, what they came up with, they put a scenario name in the URL, and then in their browser integration, they read the URL and they just grab the right request handlers and just add them on top of the happy path handlers. And I think this is just brilliant. So if I want to go through the whole app with, like network
That's
erroring,
amazing.
yeah, I just control this on every page with this particular query parameter. I think this is really neat. And for people who do a lot of client-side development, I think they should learn from this team and do something similar.
Yeah, I agree. That's really, really smart because you just expose the different server states. Even
Yeah.
like giving it to like the entire team, all they have to do is change query string and they
Yeah.
can actually test all the state. That's brilliant. And it's a simple idea, but in effect it is really, really powerful because it
Yeah.
just makes it less brittle because you don't have to go write the error
Mm-hmm.
states and every other thing. You just have to control it from the error. That is brilliant. I
Yeah.
like it.
Oh, me
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, that's really, really superb. So I have as we are, trying to like wind down, I have a question.
Yeah.
So of course you're gonna show me any other thing you want to show or MSW, but I have this um question. So I've seen you enrage on X or Twitter a couple of times because of monkey patching fetch. And I
Uh-huh.
don't work in line with intercepting network requests like you do. So I kind of get the idea, like, oh, don't monkey patch fetch. Yeah. But why? They're still like, okay,
Yeah.
what is the big deal? Because I think the most notice the most noticeable culprit in all this is next mocking patching fetch. Why is it such a pain
Yeah.
for the end developer when you do that?
So a good place to start is first to address what Next was doing, because
Mm-hmm.
I feel like they received a lot of backlash, and it is partially deserved, but it's also like we need to acknowledge that they were kind of in this very long historic run,
Okay.
and perhaps they were introducing things just to fill this developer experience gap when it was not possible yet to rely on some common ground. Like the Fetch API wasn't a node yet, and maybe with their caching proposal, well, I will always give anybody the benefit of the doubt. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
really happy that they are moving away from that. In fact, I already saw the PR that will help Next
Oh.
respect the whatever fetch you had in your environment and don't meddle with that. I think this is a fantastic direction. I'm happy that they're taking it, and I think
Mm-hmm.
it will make both their users and all the library authors around Next.js very happy. And now
Nice.
to your question, why even bother? Like, why shouldn't we mock fetch? Like, what's the big deal? I have an article written recently about this. It's not about the fetch itself, it's about why you should use mock service worker. But one of the points I make in this article is about the integrity of your system. A lot of people view mocking as something hacky and dirty, and really they're kind of right. Historically, it has been. And in this article, I illustrate, hopefully well enough, why patching fetch is a bad idea. So here's why. So what these libraries may do when they patch fetch, they basically override the fetch function. Makes sense. We're patching it.
Mm-hmm.
So you override it and it becomes your own function. Here's your black box. What's going to happen? So they probably will try to find some mock response from the mocks. And then if it exists, well, they're going to just return that mock response because that's what the user wants. And if
Yeah.
the mock is not found, they're just going to call the original fetch, which they stored before doing all the mocking, all the patching.
Mm. Okay.
Looks innocent enough. Why should we care? Well, this is why. Imagine this patched fetch running in your test or in your app. And then your app accidentally makes a GET request with a buddy. That's not really allowed. GET requests cannot have buddy. But you know what's going
Yeah.
to happen if it was a real request? You would get an error because the Fetch API
Oh.
spec will analyze your input and init parameters to fetch, and it will see that, hey, this GET request has a buddy. This is not good. You're probably making an error, and it will throw. What do you
Yeah.
think will happen if you're using a patched fetch? Nothing. Your
Nothing.
app will run, and it will even receive a mock response if it's there. This is a huge breach of your integrity. This will run in your test, showing you this nice green tick that everything's fine, and then you deploy this to production and it fails for your users. Not a
Yes.
good thing. Here's another
Mm.
example. Imagine you make a typo in a protocol, so it's not an HTTPS anymore. What would happen if this was a real request? Again, the fetch API will
Yeah.
throw. It will try to parse the URL, find an unsupported scheme that you've not defined really, and it will give you a useful error message that you're doing something wrong. What will happen with a patched fetch? Well, I think you know where we're going here. Nothing will happen. Nothing will happen because the request
Oh.
validation logic lives in the browser. It's written in
Mm-hmm.
native C code, and it will do all this heavy lifting, and it will help you ship proper code. But when you patch your fetch out, this logic is never here. It's kind of here sometimes. And to me, if I want to ship great apps, great user experiences, once again, I want them to be as close to production as possible. And your
Mm.
users in production will not run patched fetch. They will run the actual fetch. And this is
Yeah.
something that MSW allows you, developer, to do too. You can run actual fetch, actual React query, actual Apollo, anything, because we don't need to stop them anymore. I hope
Mm.
this gives the answer to the question, why should you care about patching fetch?
Yeah, it does, because just like you've mentioned, and I think it's a consistent theme from the beginning of this session, is you want to be as close to your production environment and constraint as much as possible.
Yeah.
When you patch fetch, you're straying far away from that, because in production it will break, but in dev it won't. It will actually pass. Your test will run, and you think, hey, it's all good. But when you deploy now, it's just this so too much disparity between the two environments. And that makes a lot of sense. So I guess how MSW circumvent this, or it's not even a problem for MSW, because you are implementing as close to the fetch spec as possible. Is that it? Or you like a layer on top of it? How does that work? Like, how do you not do what Next did?
It's again kind of Next doesn't really do this per se. It's more of a
Okay.
comparison between
Mm-hmm.
MSW and more conventional API mocking tools that existed in the
Mm-hmm.
past. What
Okay.
Next did was a little different. They basically disregarded your kind of fetch overrides if you introduce them. And we can touch on that in a moment. But
Okay.
I think your question was how MSW integrates here,
Yes.
what it does differently. Well, in the browser, it doesn't do this at all because it uses service worker, and any outgoing request would arrive to the service worker regardless of like what you do. You don't have to patch the fetch function
Oh.
anymore. It will be intercepted by the browser and will message the browser will message MSW and let MSW know that, hey, a request happened. But an important distinction here is that MSW also runs a node,
Yeah.
and I keep repeating myself. There's no service workers in Node, so it uses module augmentation. While it's a bit similar to this, the big difference with module augmentation is what we're trying to do. We're trying to actually execute the whole request logic, the whole request chain,
Okay.
but we're executing it in this ambiguous state. Because if you're connecting to an endpoint that you defined in your mocks, and that endpoint doesn't exist in reality, your request logic, the node's request logic, it will throw. And you want it to throw unless you have that mock defined, then you don't.
Mm-hmm.
So we run in this ambiguous environment until we know about the mocks. And if we do, we suppress those relevant errors, but we still allow any other errors to happen. So we're not throwing away your entire client request or fetch. And that's the biggest difference here.
Mm. That's interesting. Yeah, you just gave me a new term to go check out, module augmentation. I know what augmentation means, I know what a module is, but it like together sounds fun. Sounds like a
It's,
buzzword.
yeah, maybe I'm using a buzzword. The whole idea is just to extend the class. Like you have a
Okay.
client request class in OGS. So
Mm-hmm.
instead of replacing it, we're extending it. So anywhere we
Okay.
want the actual node logic to run, we just use super dot,
Mm-hmm.
anything, super dot write, super dot end, and we get those native logic running without having to like store it or anything.
Yeah, and one thing I like now that you've explained the service worker bits of MSW, is service worker sort of like it's the classic use case is for PWAs when you want to do like offline. So once you make the
Yeah.
request first, it's cached. So when you make a request, it doesn't go to your network, it goes to the service worker, and it
Yeah.
intercepts that and sends back the response already in cache. So using service worker for mocking tests is that the implementation for your mocks lie in the service worker level. So when you make your call, it hits the service worker and it just gives you back your JSON. Is that about right?
That's actually not entirely true. So
Okay.
the mocks themselves, the implementation of the mocks, they don't live in the service worker.
Okay.
MSW just uses service worker as a request stream mechanism. So
Mm,
service worker is there just to supply MSW with a request instance, and
okay.
MSW is there to return response instance to the worker. So your mocks actually live in your app. So you can use your favorite languages like TypeScript. You can reuse utilities. You can just handle it like a regular code. Like I showed you in the Remix app, it's just
Yeah.
a mocks/handlers.ts. Like you don't even touch the worker. The worker is like half implementation detail of MSW,
Okay.
and it just uses it to provide interception and apply responses. But the whole matching logic and your network description, it lives in your application.
Nice. So I think I was thinking about it all wrong. That sort of makes sense. So that's so the service worker is sort of like for the interception, but the
Yeah.
actual matching is in your application code.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fun. So so this is like going on a tangent, but do you think it's possible to have that done? Like the full implementation on the service worker? Is
You
there
mean
any
like
benefits to doing that?
having the mocks in the worker?
Yeah.
It is definitely possible. In fact, this is how MSW started. But
Okay.
the problem with this, workers are a bit unusual. So first of
Mm-hmm.
all, the worker will be kind of applied and cached, for the lack of a
Mm-hmm.
better word, controlling your client basically forever. So if you want to
Okay.
change how you handle a request, well, you change the worker code, but this doesn't mean that this new worker will be applied to a client. In fact, it won't be applied. As I
Oh,
mentioned, browser will
true.
actually try to analyze them, and if the browser sees that there's a newer version of the worker, what it will do, it will keep the old worker running so it doesn't break your cache in regular applications, and it will just
Okay.
schedule the new worker to be applied whenever browser finds more suitable. And you don't control this element, and this is why it's a huge developer experience degradation. So
Mm,
instead, what we came up with, we moved the mocks to your app, and we use a message channel between the worker and your app just to exchange basically request response information. We
mm.
serialize them and we exchange them, and this is how they talk to each other.
Nice. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I do know to invalidate the worker is actually a thing where okay, like there's a new change in the worker.
Yeah.
How do you tell the browser to like take it now? And I know in most times in PWAs you will be pop up with like okay, there's a new change now. You have to click this button, but you don't want that in development, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's yeah, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah,
And
fun.
like one more point is, let's say you want to write mocks in TypeScript. Let's say you
Mm-hmm.
want to actually have type safe mocks and you want to reuse some information you have from external sources, like maybe types generated from an OpenAPI spec, or maybe
Okay.
types generated from your GraphQL schema. Well, now you have to write the whole worker in TypeScript and it will not run in the browser. So you have to
Of course.
introduce a build step to the worker, which just
Mm.
complicates the things a lot. You see what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And of course, you had to learn this from experience, which is really, really good because now you know the limitations of workers for this sort of purpose. So you sort of like use it as like a middleman between the
Yeah.
app and your actual mocks. And I think that's brilliant because now the worker is very thin. It just
Mhm.
routes requests
Yeah,
and it probably won't change all that much, but your mocks can do all the changing because of course it just it just send back the state of the mocks.
exactly.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I got one more question.
Go ahead.
So yeah. So what other things does MSW provide that gives users of it an aha moment? Like those sort of moments to be like, aha, like it does this. This is like a lifesaver. This is a no-brainer. First of all, you've shown with the scenarios one, which is brilliant. Are there any other aha moments? Even you yourself would have found.
I think what I really like are two things. So
Mm-hmm.
one of the things was enabled by us rewriting MSW to use the fetch API spec. So we
Okay.
represent intercepted requests and we ask you to define mock responses using the fetch API spec. This basically means you handle them as you handle regular fetch calls. And this enabled us to do things like streaming. And I love this. So here's an
Yeah.
example of how you can mock a video stream. And it's just become so simple. It's silly to me. I absolutely love this. So you introduce a readable stream instance in your mock, and you control the chunks you push to the stream. And then you just respond with this readable stream, and that's it. In fact,
Hmm.
I have a really great lesson about this in my Egghead course, because this is more of a contrived example. Obviously, like the three
Of
strings in
course.
a row is not a video. But in my Egghead course, I feature how we can take an actual video file and not only use it as a mock stream, we can actually control each individual chunk and insert a server-side delay between chunks. So imagine
Mm.
you writing the next Netflix app, and you want to test how your UI handles this stutters of network. You know, you like
Yeah.
streaming the first bit of the video, and then you need to load it. So how do you test
Mm-hmm.
this loader? Well, you insert delay between these chunks, and it just works magically. This is one
Wow.
thing I like. And I think there is a second thing which was proposed by contributors. And this one, where is it living? Yeah, I called it polling. But the idea is because your request handlers are just regular JavaScript, you can use generator functions to
Mm.
respond to the same request differently based on when and how you requested. This is really cool. So in this example, it allows you to poll for the weather. So each GET request would get a different degree until it reaches some condition, and then the response will always be the same. I think this is really cool. And
Mm-hmm.
some people already wondered, like, how do I provide different type of responses based on how many times I requested the resource? And you can use generators. So standard JavaScript to allow you to do this.
Of course. And one thing I like about developer tools, I really like when they stick very, very close to like the language or the platform,
Yeah,
because it's sort of like, so anyone who knows JavaScript knows MSW like out of like just out of the box, because it's just JavaScript. Like your handlers are JavaScript is an array. You just expose a couple of helpers, then you do your stuff. So yeah, that makes sense. And I really like the use of, I don't see generator functions used that much in the wild, but I really
it's
like
true.
the implementation here. Yeah, it's one of those features that be like, oh, they're only for library authors, and I don't even know who uses it.
Yeah, I think it has its applications. Just, if you never cross paths with generators, it's fine.
Yeah, so for me, two things is in that a JavaScript line, generators functions, and I think proxies.
Oh,
I think
proxies are amazing.
yeah, Vue uses it a lot. I get the idea, but I haven't had the need to use it in my own kind of code. So I'm really looking for opportunities to,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's fun. So yeah, thank you so much, Artem. Any other thing you want to share? And this, you could plug anything as a get. I know you're doing a course workshop. Do you want to talk about that? What you're
Yeah,
working on?
sure. Just a quick mention that just recently I joined with Kenzie Dots to work on Epic Web.dev, and I will be teaching all of you everything I know about testing. We will start slow from the fundamentals, but we're going to cover a lot. And I just wanted to use this opportunity to let the folks know. I already put
Mm-hmm.
up a few articles and videos on epicweb.dev. So go and check those out and stay tuned for more announcements about the courses and workshops coming in the future. But what you can actually do right now, especially if you want to learn more about MSW, I released an Egghead course last year that's called Mock REST and GraphQL APIs with Mock Service Worker. And I think people
Mm.
love this course. And the point of it is to just walk you through the whole experience from installing and setting the library up to basically going through a bunch of different use cases. Because in this course, we're going to build a movie streaming app. from scratch and complete mock first. So you will learn how to handle server-side and client-side requests, how to handle dynamic requests, authentication, also how to mock different
Mm.
responses. The app will be talking to both REST and GraphQL APIs, local and third-party, and you will even see some advanced usage like mocking streams and combining original and mock responses. I think you're going to love it. So if you want to learn more about MSW, if you want to dive in, just head to Egghead and watch this course. And I think it will be really useful to you.
Yeah, definitely. You all go check out the mock REST and GraphQL APIs with mock service worker on Egghead, and also look at I'm going to link to the if there are links already for the Epic Stack courses and workshops, and also leave this link in the description as well. So yeah, I think we could stop sharing now, and you get to like tell us any last piece of wisdom on testing, web development, or anything in general that has been on your mind lately. Like, yeah, just speak to us as a developer.
General wisdom.
Yeah.
I think one topic that I keep coming to recently is in automated testing. Like a lot of people view testing as a very complex thing, and rightfully, it can be really complex. It's true. I used to be afraid of testing, but I think what really matters when you start testing and even when you test it for years, it's really important that you understand some of the basics right. And a lot of folks just discard that,
Mm.
like just experience bias or like I don't need this basics, but I just can't express how crucial this is. I keep coming back to my older tests and then I compare them with my more recent tests, and I can see this journey. I can see this bias. I can see where I thought I knew stuff and then I actually learned stuff. And this is what I'm trying to do at Epic Web right now, especially with a bunch of these articles I'm putting up, which are more kind of conceptual, philosophical, but I do
Mhm.
try to distill them to the very essence of testing. Like I have this article about the true purpose of testing. And I really think that a lot of people will be surprised what's the true point of a test is.
Yeah.
So my piece of wisdom is keep an open mind. I think everybody wins if you don't assume that you know everything and you just kind of listen to different feedback. This is definitely what I do. I don't know everything and I'm here to learn just as the rest of us, but I'm
Mhm.
trying to keep an open mind as much as I can to different frameworks, different testing practices, because in the end, if you do, you're going to learn a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Keep an open mind. And I think one
Yeah.
thing that I've noticed is I don't know if it's more newer devs or even older devs. Like there's just a certain camp of devs that I think they've been beaten in the past, or they've been told testings are a nightmare, or they have seen awful tests, very brittle tests,
Mhm.
very cumbersome tests, and they just,
Yeah.
made the opinion that all tests are bad and they're not going to write any tests, right? So I feel like the DX for testing has improved over the years,
Yeah.
and there's always an advantage to testing your code because you can never manual test everything, right? So you should
Of course.
always like endeavor to at least have some form of automated testing, and yeah, keep an
Yeah.
open mind and
Yeah.
learn
I think,
as
yeah, automated testing is definitely something that everybody can fall in love with. And I will do
Mhm.
my best to show people how and show how amazing it is.
Yeah, for sure, please do. So where can folks reach out to you? So after seeing this session, they want to say hi or ask you questions. Where do you hang out on socials these days?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at
Mm-hmm.
Ketanito, or you can find me on my blog site, ketanito.com. And I also have a Discord. You can find everything on the site as well. So I'm mainly
Mm-hmm.
around Discord, including KCD Discord. So come say hi, ask a question, and yeah, just hang around.
Definitely. So yeah, I'm going to link to all those, and
Yeah.
thank you so much for teaching me mocking service worker, your amazing API mocking tool. And yeah, I really understand the full picture now, and this was really fun. Thank you so much, Artem.
Thank you. It's a great honor. Thank you for having me here. And yeah, wish you all the best. Thank you.